The Malevolence is a Subjugator class heavy cruiser and one of the nastiest ships the Separatist ever fielded. It is enormous at about 4,845 meters, and it carries a fearsome mix of weapons and systems that let it bully entire task forces. Its edge isn't based on its size alone. What makes it special is that it comes from 2 mega-ion cannons that fire a widening ring of energy. That pulse shuts down power across anything it touches, which drops shields, guns, and comms. Imagine a flying EMP cannon. Yes, that's exactly what this ship is. Once targets are dead in space, hundreds of turbo lasers finish the job. In practice, that means the Malevolence wins before a normal battle even starts. Even the strongest ships turn into target practice when the Malevolence is around. Its first appearance was during the Clone Wars when the Republic heard about it through mystery attacks that left no survivors. But in a meeting with Obi-Wan's fleet, Shadow Squadron torpedoed the ion cannon housing and crippled the ship, which forced a running fight while Kenobi and Yuuzhan closed in. Because of its sheer size and weaponry, it outclasses other Separatist workhorses. A Munificent class frigate is about 825 meters long and was often only strong in bigger fleets. A Providence class Dreadnought runs about 1,088 to over 2,177 meters, and was far stronger and often were the capital ships of the Separatist fleets. However, none of them even came close to the Malevolence, who single-handedly took out the Republic fleets. To compare it against the Republic's Venator, a Venator Class Star Destroyer is a little over 1,100 meters and is built to carry fighters and also had good firepower overall. However, if something like the Malevolence's ion cannon can disable the whole fighter squadron in the Republic fleet, it's just far superior. However, despite it being extremely powerful, it was eventually destroyed when Anakin's bomber squadron managed to damage the ion cannon while it was about to fire, short-circuiting the ship and basically leaving it defenseless. It was then ultimately destroyed when its sabotaged Navy computer sent it to the dead moon of Antar. I do always wonder why the CIS didn't just build more copies of the Malevolence, but I suppose it was too hard to replicate. The Republic's strongest ship was obviously the Venator Class Star Destroyer. It was their workhorse and heavy hitter all in one package during the height of the Clone Wars. In fact, it became the basis for the Empire's own Star Destroyer. The Venator stretched about 1,137 meters, carried tough shields and armor, and carried huge fighter wings in its massive hangars. It was also well armed with heavy turbo lasers. In a fleet, they were extremely versatile as they could dish out damage while also flooding the battle with fighters like Y-Wings, Z-95 Headhunters, or ARC-170 starfighters. This versatility was the reason that Venators were everywhere in the Clone Wars. They fought at Christophsis, Ryloth, the Second Battle of Geonosis, and pretty much at every battle in the Clone Wars, and were often the flagships for the Jedi. Against Separatist ships, the Venator had clear edges. The Munificent class frigate was shorter and relied on packs of ships with big guns but thinner protection. A Venator could tank the opening salvos, punch through with heavier volleys, and let its fighters peel those frigates apart. Other ships, like the Providence class carrier, were just as big and menacing. However, while the Providence's main role was to bring out large droid swarms, the Venator matched its power because of its clone squadrons. Within the Republic's own roster, the Venator stood above common ships. The Acclamator was a solid assault ship for landings, but it lacked the shielding and fighter capacity of a Venator. Although at the end of the Clone Wars the Victory class was introduced, which had better armament, it wasn't even close to the versatility that the Venator offered with the starfighter squadrons and its firepower. Essentially, the Venator was the Republic's Swiss Army knife, combining versatility with balance in a way no other Republic ship could. That's why, after the rise of the Empire, the Venator was repainted and pressed into early service, becoming the standard of power for the Imperial forces. A few changes and upgrades here and there transformed this versatile beast into the more menacing Imperial Star Destroyer. For the Galactic Empire, the Executor class Super Star Destroyer sits at the top of the Empire's food chain for a reason. And it's usually because of its out-of-this-world size. The classic example is the Executor, Vader's flagship. It stretches about 19 kilometers long. It carries thousands of turbo lasers and ion cannons, multiple shield domes, and a small army of TIEs and shuttles. It hauls legions of troops, walkers, and support craft. In battle, it acts like a moving fortress and a command hub. So, when a Super Star Destroyer like the Executor appears in battle, it wins and ends fights in a hurry. Compared to other ships like the standard Imperial Star Destroyer, there's a big difference in terms of firepower and sheer size. The Super Star Destroyer makes other Star Destroyers look like standard fighters. That's why it's a symbol of power and overwhelming dominance. Against the Rebels, the Empire's giant ship was built to break morale, because there were no other ships that could match its size and power. None of the Rebel ships even came close to its power. Within the Star Wars storyline, the Executor was Darth Vader's flagship during much of his campaign to end the Rebels. He stalked the Rebels after the Battle of Hoth, dominating the sky over the fleet, and allowed the Sith Lord to have a throne to command from. At Endor, meanwhile, the Rebels eventually found a way to turn the tide. While they never had the firepower to destroy something as large as the Executor, a stray A-Wing managed to ram the massive ship's bridge after destroying its shields. This caused the Executor to be pulled into the second Death Star's gravitational field, destroying one of the Empire's biggest symbols of power and dominance. Meanwhile, some of the other Super Star Destroyers met quieter ends and were lost in shipyard catastrophes and Civil War skirmishes during the final days of the Empire. The MC-80 Star Cruiser were the strongest Rebel ships and often those seen as leaders of the fleet. They were built by the Mon Calamari, one of the Rebel Alliance's biggest allies. It measured about 12 to 1,300 meters, which made it the biggest ship in the Rebel fleet, and carried heavy turbo lasers, ion cannons, tractor beams, and powerful long-range sensors. What made it unique was it could dish out 360 degrees of fire as its turbo lasers could cover the ship from any angle. If necessary, it was even well armed enough to carry out planetary bombardments. Its shields were also famously tough, as the Mon Calamari used several different shield generators to make up its shields. Big hangars and a full starfighter wing let it keep patrols and escorts in the air for hours. Home 1 was the best-known example of the MC-80 class ship. It served as Admiral Akbar's flagship with expanded command spaces, reinforced hull plating, and multiple hangars that kept pilots cycling in and out. It felt like a moving headquarters that could also trade heavy blows because of its ability to send out fighters and tank hits from Star Destroyers and TIE fighters alike. It was the only Rebel ship that could even go toe-to-toe with an Imperial Star Destroyer, which, mind you, was considered an incredible feat at that time in the galaxy. Although it couldn't quite match the ISD's firepower, the Home 1's shielding was superior, as it was made up of several shield generators, which meant it could outlast the ISD. Also, thanks to its superior fighter wings of X-Wing and Y-Wings compared to the Imperial TIE fighters, the MC-80 would often come out victor in a 1 versus 1. That made a big difference in drawn-out fleet battles, allowing the MC-80 to outclass Star Destroyers in terms of sheer resiliency. While Imperial ships were meant to win in a hurry, like a sprint, the MC-80 was meant for drawn-out battles, where its marathon-like stamina made it shine. During the Battle of Endor, the Home 1 led the Rebel fleet into the battle against the Death Star and the Imperial fleet, eventually succeeding in bringing victory to the Rebel Alliance. Even during the New Republic era, the Home 1 remained in service, becoming one of the lasting symbols of hope and peace throughout the galaxy. The Nebula Class Star Destroyer was the New Republic's heavy hitter, mostly during the time of their war with the Yuuzhan Vong. It was about 1,040 meters long and carried a compact but capable air wing of roughly 60 fighters with room for troops and support craft. It packed heavy turbo lasers, ion cannons, missile tubes, and strong tractor beams, but its real edge was thick armor and very tough shields tied to efficient power systems. It entered service around 15 ABY as part of the new class program. They were few in number, so commanders used them where the stakes were highest. During the Yuuzhan Vong War, they shifted from core defense to critical offensives and proved they could take punishment while protecting lighter escorts. Essentially, the Nebula class was the perfect ship to counter the Vong's own ships. Its heavy turbo lasers allowed sustained bursts of laser fire that were strong enough to damage the Vong's healing ships. And due to their defensive capabilities, these ships could withstand damage and keep the fight going for long periods. Of course, the Nebula was different from the standard Mon Cal cruisers that anchored the rebellion in the New Republic. Mon Cal cruisers were known for their defensive capabilities and resilience. However, the Nebula's concentrated firepower made it the staple ship for offense, which the New Republic needed against the Vong's own ships. As such, Nebulas were prominent during the Black Fleet Crisis era, often as centerpiece ships used for elite task forces. After all, their strong blend of offense and defense proved invaluable against the Yuuzhan Vong's world ships. The Yuuzhan Vong were known to be deep space travelers who used organic material instead of technology. That explains the Venator Class ship. This is basically a living city-sized vessel that doubles as the Vong's carrier, transport, and battleship. It's an all-in-one ship designed to provide the needs of the monstrous Vong while they took over countless star systems throughout the galaxy. Most examples are around 10 kilometers across, and the largest reach truly monstrous scales. The largest known Venator is 120 kilometers long. That's more than double the length of New York City. Now, you could just imagine how huge this flying city is. The Venator's strength comes from living systems. Dovin basals create gravity to push or pull the ship and swallow enemy fire, and Yaret core launch superheated magma with uncanny accuracy. It carries armies, starfighters, and supplies for years, and it can heal damages and adapt like a living organism. These world ships were known to ferry invasion forces into the galaxy because they were self-sustaining enough to never need to dock on another planet for a long period of time to replenish resources. That's why the Vong were so effective as conquerors. They used these ships to move from one area to another to wreak havoc across the New Republic. However, these ships were not invincible because some of them could age out and die. Concentrated fire from multiple ships could also damage it faster than it could heal. What made these ships different from other ships is the fact that they were essentially self-sustaining compared to ships like the Star Destroyer or even the Republic's own MC-80. For example, the Empire's Imperial Class Star Destroyers project fear through volume of fire. Against a world ship, that fire loses bite once Dovin basals start gulping shots and peeling shields away with its magma. The organic hull also soaks up a lot of damage. That's why the New Republic struggled so much when they faced the Yuuzhan Vong. Something like the Venator was just so weird, as it was a living organism and a really unique addition to Star Wars lore. During the era of the Old Republic, Darth Revan had just returned as a Sith Lord and plunged the galaxy into yet another war after the brutal Mandalorian Wars. This war was the Jedi Civil War. The ship Revan used most prominently was the Interdictor class cruiser. As its name suggests, they were capable of creating artificial gravitational fields that would be able to prevent ships from entering hyperspace as well as pull them out of it. Each interdictor was about 600 meters long with a split hull, a tall command tower. They carried fighter squadrons, boarding parties, and also strong armor. Tractor beams also held any ship in place that dropped they pulled out of hyperspace. Due to their gravity well projector, they served an extremely important purpose in Revan's empire, as he could dictate where the battles would take place and also set traps for the Republic on his terms. The interdictors were also rather strong, as they were well armed with turbo lasers and capable of single-handedly going toe-to-toe with the Republic's hammerheads with ease. The most famous example was the Leviathan under Admiral Saul Karath. It hunted Jedi across the Rim and anchored the blockade over Taurus during the search for Bastila. That siege ended with the Upper City in ruins and the Leviathan's name feared from core to frontier. Later on, our heroes were captured aboard the Leviathan, but managed to cut their way out after a run through its detention decks. The ship limped on, but Karath fell during the fight, and the crew lost its edge. Many sister ships died later at Rakata Prime when the Starforge burned and the Sith fleet collapsed. To go up against the Interdictor, the Old Republic fielded the Hammerhead Cruisers. It made its claim to fame during the Old Republic, particularly during Revan's rise to power in the middle of the old Sith Wars and the Mandalorian Wars. The ship was also widely used during the Jedi Civil War and even into the Great Galactic War. They were only 315 meters in length, which made them a lot smaller than the Sith vessels of the time. However, they were very versatile, had alright firepower for its time, and were efficient against enemy cruisers as well as against fighters. Against the Revan Sith Empire, though, it punched above its size. Sith Interdictors and Centurion-class ships were bigger and hit harder in a one-on-one clash, but the Hammerhead could put up a fight as they'd be supported better by fighters. In other words, while the Hammerhead didn't have the strongest firepower or the most resilient defense, it did everything well enough. It was very small for a capital ship, but it was dependable, adaptable, and always ready for a fight. The Endar Spire was one of the more prominent Hammerhead carriers. It served as a Republic command ship over Taurus, carrying Bastila Shan, but it was destroyed in the opening moments of the first KOTOR game. But what an epic name it had, right? We'll forever love that name, Endar Spire. Enter the Old Republic era and the Sith Empire under Emperor Vitiate. The Harrower class Dreadnought was their most prominent capital ship. It ran about 800 meters with a split prow, heavy armor, strong shields, and multiple hangars. It carried a sizable starfighter wing and lots of troops, so it could break a line and also keep a battle group coordinated. Harrowers were at the heart of the Great Galactic War, first appearing in the cinematic trailers where they reconquered Korriban. They were also prominent during the sacking of Coruscant and stayed in service through the Cold War and the Second Galactic War. During the Great Galactic War, it often went up against the Republic's Valor Class cruisers. These were able to match the Harrower in firepower, however had lighter shields, but were more fast and agile. But usually a Harrower would be able to defeat a Valor in a one-on-one. But the thing about the Harrower is that it required an immense amount of energy and materials to produce. As such, it was mostly used as a flagship for some of the Sith Empire's most important figures. Then again, it was worth it because a single Harrower could take on starfighters and smaller warships on its own without requiring a fleet to back it up. This made it a force to be reckoned with as a one-ship army capable of handling smaller fleets. There was a time when the Old Republic and the Mandalorians were in a heated war that placed the Jedi at the front lines against their Mandalorian rivals. Of course, because the Mandalorians built weapons and ships designed to counter the abilities of the Jedi and the Republic had to counter with its own weapons. That was what the Inexpugnable Class tactical command ship was for. It wasn't strictly a weapon per se, but was more of a mobile fleet headquarters specifically built for the Mandalorian Wars. There, they often acted as command vessels for the Republic fleets while having Hammerhead Cruisers protect it. It is enormous, at roughly 3 kilometers long, and it carries a small city's worth of command centers, hangars, and support bays. That size lets it host big amounts of fighters and frigates. It also had very heavy armor and layered shields. What made these floating fortresses invaluable during the Mandalorian Wars was not only the fact that they carried small cities of armies, but also the fact that they were nerve centers in a war far away from the galaxy's core. As the planet Mandalore was in the Outer Rim, it was essential for the Jedi and the Republic to have a large vessel acting as a command center in battles where backup could be several light years away. So essentially, the Inexpugnable acted as a fleet on its own, and was essentially capable of multiplying the power of an actual fleet of smaller vessels. Of course, there was nothing perfect about this ship, explaining why its type never lasted long. Individual hulls were battered, and entire Inexpugnable ships were sometimes destroyed. But the idea of building one ship that makes every other ship around it better stuck. Not too long after, the idea of large command ships became a norm, partly due to the lessons the Old Republic learned when they fielded this massive ship. Star Destroyers and Super Star Destroyers are already incredibly large and imposing on their own. But here comes the mega-class Star Dreadnought in the form of the Supremacy. It was the First Order's ultimate flagship that made every other flagship look like an ant. The ship looked like a flying wing the size of a moving city. As a reference, the ship is around 3 times larger than the Executor, which itself was around the size of Manhattan. That's why the Supremacy was built to be both a warship and a headquarters. It carried factories, docks, legions of troops, and a huge starfighter wing. Its firepower and layered shields made it a fleet killer. It also hosted the system that let the First Order track enemies through hyperspace, which turned escapes into long chases. What made it more fearsome was the fact that it was already a fleet on its own, but still had a large fleet of Star Destroyers flanking it. A single Star Destroyer is already hard enough to deal with, but something that's exponentially bigger and treats Star Destroyers as fighters is an entirely different problem. This puts the Mega Class on a class of its own, pun intended. It also served as Supreme Leader Snoke's floating and moving headquarters, where he led the First Order in its quest to destroy the Resistance once and for all. And under his leadership were more than 2 million people working inside the Supremacy because something this large needed not thousands, but millions to keep it running. Against the Rebel Alliance and later the Resistance, ships like the MC-80 and the MC-85 Radis were courageous but outgunned. However, while there were no Resistance ships powerful enough to take on this massive fortress, a brave sacrificial move eventually destroyed it. Admiral Holdo ended the Supremacy by pushing the Radis to light speed to ram it through the Mega Class. The move, now known as the Holdo Maneuver, was the only way of stopping the Supremacy. What a great twist, ain't it? This is totally not sarcasm, by the way. If the First Order had its own heavy hitters, the Resistance countered it with the MC-85 Star Cruiser, which is its own heavy hitter during their skirmishes. It is a massive Mon Calamari capital ship, about 3.4 kilometers long, with the rounded city ship look that Mon Cala designs are known for. Its hull is layered and compartmentalized, so battle damage does not cripple it quickly. It also carried powerful deflector shields, mini turbo laser and ion batteries, missile tubes, and enough hangar space for starfighters and support craft. That's why it was built to be a flagship and a fortress at the same time. The ship was a lot bigger than standard Resistance and Rebel ships, but not as big as the ones the Empire and the First Order fielded. Still, it had the standard toughness that Mon Calamari ships were known for. The most prominent of these ships was the Raddus, Leia Organa's flagship during the evacuation of Dakar. After the First Order arrived, the MC-85 led a running escape that stretched across space and ended near Crate. Even while under sustained fire, it kept the fleet alive by soaking up punishment and coordinating launches, rescues, and rearguard actions. The Resistance mostly had smaller vessels like CR-90 corvettes, Nebulon sea frigates, and Free Virgilia bunker busters. But the MC-85 dwarfed them in size, shielding, and command capability, so it could stand toe-to-toe with a First Order Star Destroyer and still protect a convoy. Against the First Order lineup, it was tougher than their standard Resurgent class destroyers in sheer power and size, as its shields were just superior. However, siege dreadnoughts like the Fulminatrix and the vast Supremacy carried super heavy guns and tracking tech that could have easily beaten an MC-85 in a fight. Despite this, the MC-85 was still rather versatile, and thus the Resistance's best ship. The Raddus itself was eventually destroyed when Holdo rammed it into the Supremacy. That's it. Like and subscribe.